So this is what we're going to look at today. Really, this is digging into the sorts of processes that you need to support solutions approaches in a serious way or at scale in a newsroom once you perhaps have started to do a bit of experimentation and really want to begin to adopt this, and what barriers exist that you might need processes for. We'll think about becoming a solutions journalism champion, and that will cover whether you are an editor and you want to introduce it to your newsroom, or whether you're a reporter and you want to encourage perhaps the adoption with your colleagues and bring editorial management on a journey and get their buy-in. And then what is your action plan? So how do you do this? What are your steps? And we have steps, suggested steps for both editors and managers, and also for individuals. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So very much looking forward to the next 60 to 90 minutes. And yeah, so we'll get started. So first of all, what sorts of processes do we need to support the implementation, the rollout of solutions journalism in a newsroom? Well, the first thing is what do you need to plan for? What kinds of risks or barriers might come up that you'd need to have a think about so that you can develop processes for that as part of your plan? So the first thing is really understanding what solutions or constructive journalism is. It can be daunting if it's new. And not understanding what characterizes a solution story can make it difficult to plan for implementing them. And you may also find, just continued lack of understanding around what these types of approaches are. People sometimes still confuse it with public relations or advocacy or campaigning. It's none of these things. So just understanding what it is will help you prepare for that. Also, it's true that solutions journalism stories can take longer. The stories themselves can take a bit longer. First of all, to gather the evidence and data that you will need as one of your 4 pillars, if you like, of a solution story. It's that evidence and data that stops it from being public relations or advocacy. So you do need it, and it does take a bit of extra time. You may also need extra time at the beginning if the processes to source the solutions are still taking shape. And also, we've found that coming up with a solution story can be easier if it's front of mind when you're doing your regular news gathering. Much in the way that when we're thinking about producing multimedia content, if you're a print or digital text reporter, if you haven't thought about the multimedia that you'll need until towards the end of the story process, it takes a lot longer. So if something's front of mind at the very beginning, and to think what there might be a solutions angle to this right at the beginning of your story journey, then it will speed it up. But if you don't, it will take longer. So one of the responses that you can take to this is to pursue training. So make sure that you've got your introductory training for reporters and editors. This series from the Foundation aims to be that, and it's all freely available to you on our website, all the slide decks, all the handouts, everything that you would need to know. You could also run this as a session within your newsroom for your colleagues. Advanced training for existing staff as they build skills. And as we'll hear today, some of the case studies of implementation have found that it's great to have solutions journalism training built into your onboarding processes, and also to build that in to allow for churn. So you might train one group of reporters, but 2 years later, people may have moved on to new jobs. So if you build it into your onboarding, everyone's good to go straight out of the gate. So I wanted to talk a little bit about implementation case studies. I've pulled together some case studies from the US. The Solutions Journalism Network is headquartered in the United States, and there's been, I suppose, quite a lot of progress in the US. So I've pulled out some case studies of different sized newsrooms. Most of them are smaller to medium sized. And I'm so delighted that Sabra and Drew are here to talk to us about large scale multi-platform broadcasters as well over the course of this session. So the Flint Beat is an outlet in the States, and they took a top level decision to build solutions into their business. They ran what's called a stop-start continue to support this new output alongside their regular output. And we'll talk about what a stop-start continue is in a moment. They defined the types of stories they wanted to prioritize. So they chose genres that were a really good fit for their existing audience, and also thought about the scale at which they wanted to do this work that was achievable for the business. And then they set specific goals for each team across the Flint Beat business. So management have goals around vision, direction, the rollout schedule, and so on. Learning and organizational development, role-specific training. So looking at what different kinds of people needed. Editorial training, so what sorts of output people would need to be producing. Then for the business side, thinking about capturing impact. And that's so that then the marketing teams were able to communicate with audience and revenue sources. And lastly, training for and goals for the HR team. So how would you onboard people? Let's turn now to the Arizona Daily Reporter. They hired a dedicated reporter to follow up on regular news. So their approach was fairly simple. It was just hire someone, that's their job. At the Dallas Morning News, they chose specific newsroom teams to be early adopters. So they chose the education lab, the arts team, and the science and health team. And there's quite a good overlap with all of these topics with solutions approaches. They also identified stories that might take a bit longer, such as a week or two, or longer term project stories, and put a bit of extra resources into those. In this series from the Walkley Foundation, we've covered off how solution stories can be stronger on audience engagement and help drive revenue. And so with that in mind, they were looking for specific investment in particular kinds of stories. And this kind of output provides a high quality proof of concept to inspire the rest of the business. So hopefully all of these things will help you start to think, oh, that might work for us, or this other approach might work for us. Let's look at the Richland Source. So the Richland Source is a US-based solutions-focused newsroom. So that's very much their raison d'etre. They're very much about this. So it's built in from both top down and bottom up. Solutions is built into onboarding, output, and there are also KPIs and performance management steps involved. And they have processes in place now for peer-to-peer evaluations, which is simply just circulating a story and asking for people's feedback on it once every sort of week or month. And so what do we think about this? What would have been done well? What would have been done better to get that sort of feedback and that can inspire people. And then also the example of the Montana Free Press. So it's editor-driven in editorial meetings to look for a solutions angle. So that's their approach. And so they're building a culture there of looking for angles on stories. So these are different ways of thinking about implementation. So before we move on, I want to just turn to Sabra and Drew and just ask you guys, what sorts of processes are you looking at the ABC and Al Jazeera? Sabra, do you want to join us first? You're on mute.
Sure. Thank you, Corinne, for that. My interest in this came from increase in news avoidance in Australia. So I was really interested, around 2017, 2018 at the increasing number of people that were avoiding the news, but I also found that I was avoiding the news myself. And I think that's crucial in talking about what we're doing in regards to solutions journalism. Because if you look at the digital Reuters study that comes out every year, and the next one I think is due next month, news avoidance, Australians, we love being gold medal winners in all sorts of things, and we are gold medal winners when it comes to news avoidance. 69% is the figure in Australia. So think about that. That's nearly 7 in 10 people who say they avoid keeping up with the news for various reasons. It's really interesting. I'm cutting a really long story short. I won a scholarship last year through the ABC to go to the UK and study this. And I met a really interesting fellow in the UK who does not like using the term news avoidance at all, because it puts the blame with the audience and not with us, the journalists doing the journalism. That we really need to reflect on why people are turning away from what we're doing. And I think it's principally It's not one reason, there are a number of reasons, but it's because we present overwhelmingly a negative picture of what's going on in the world around us. That may have been okay when the news model was very different 20 years ago, but the news model has changed. And so for people, it feels like a tsunami of bad news all the time, and it doesn't reflect their real world. It really doesn't. So solutions journalism, really, we're looking at completing the circle, as others, Corinne, you would have heard. We do breaking news really well and daily news really well. We do investigative journalism really well, what went wrong and why, but we don't do the next bit very well. What are people doing to overcome these problems? Now that we've reported on them, what are the solutions? How are people fixing them? And that essentially is what we're talking about. So at the ABC, I know that more and more we're including this from an editorial perspective in daily editorial meetings. We're looking at stories. We're looking at stories from the context of, why is this important for the audience to know? And if we cannot answer that context question of why this is important, we shouldn't be doing the story. It's that simple. And when we're looking at stories, we ask the question, is someone tackling this in some way? Are they fixing it in some way? We should be making an effort to find that. So, for example, we've had a whole, we've been focusing this year on violence against women and children. And we made a really strong concerted effort on AM to be looking not only at reporting these problems, because we know that it is a problem. We know it's a problem in society, but what are people doing to tackling it? And you know what? There are various groups around the country who are taking different approaches to dealing with this issue. So we reported in those stories different ways. Sure, we couldn't turn them around. Some of those stories, we couldn't turn them around in a day, because sometimes it takes you a while to find the right case studies and the right data and information to feed that story, because, it's just not fluff or advocacy journalism. We actually want the data to back up what we're talking about. So, that's how we're making it part of our practice. I have been on a personal crusade about this, because I believe that we need to be doing news differently. That's been the biggest challenge. A lot of journos, usually around my age, saying, but this is not the way that we've, taught journalism. You're dead right. We taught journalism a different way in a different time, and times have changed. And I really think that we need to be giving a more accurate view of the world to the people who are consuming us. Not everything in their world is bad, and we need to be telling that story.
Thanks. And I'm really looking forward to digging more into the personal journey that you've been on as we go through the session. We're about to talk about individual champions, which I'm looking forward to. Drew, how have you approached the process of implementation at Al Jazeera? And we'll talk about some of the projects that you've done throughout the webinar, but just in terms of the process for rollout, how would you describe that at Al Jazeera?
Yeah, well, I think if anyone knows or spends an hour watching Al Jazeera, it's kind of a bit synonymous with doom and gloom, like disasters in the global south, particularly with reporting on Gaza. But I work within Al Jazeera's programs department, making half-hour documentaries and current affairs shows. And I think, when you're trying to make those long-form projects, it's like you think, what is the value add to the news that they're seeing, those quick, small news pieces? How can we add context? What is the use of, investing 25 minutes of my time? It's not just about learning information anymore. It's also about, how can I use this inspiration and be inspired to essentially use it in a way that constructively improves one's own life. And that's what we hear when we do a lot of surveys of our audience, and a lot of them are quite young in countries like the Philippines and Indonesia. They don't just want to be informed, and they certainly don't want to be depressed. They want things that constructively show how communities are bettering themselves, particularly in global South contexts, where traditionally the news media has often depicted global South people as, passive, letting circumstances overcome them. And, I've worked on all 5 continents. It simply isn't true. And I think that's why I really kind of embraced constructive journalism. And I'd say, I heard Sabra talk about this in a podcast, and You know, she was presenting a program and she felt a sense of just so it's a bit more of a conversation. Why don't you say what happened? Because I wanted to say something about it. Like something happened to you that kind of led to this kind of pivot and go on this journey. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Sabra. I thought
That's
basically,
all
you
right.
know,
I'm
you were
struggling with my
affected by.
mute button here. Look,
Okay, sorry.
look, I mean, we've had, we told, and this is going back a couple of years ago, we told a really particularly depressing story about the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And it was a really dark and terrible story. And there's no doubting that there are many people with a disability who struggle to be heard and struggle to get the money that they need. But I knew that there was a positive story, and I knew that people were really rallying to try and do something for their community. So we had another crack at telling that story, and we told it a week later. It was about basically a community in Longreach in Queensland. We're trying to get together and argue to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Look, we know that you usually individually pool your money so that people have got individual plans, but given where we live, we want to pool our money together and we want to build a house so that we've got some sort of respite care here that we don't have to send people hundreds of kilometres away for. And we told that story. And we also told the story about how the council was willing to give up, and they'd already set aside a piece of land where they could build the house. And they'd approached the federal government, and Bill Shorten was due to visit them to have a look and you know, talk with them face to face and see what they were proposing. But that was really, you know, showing how people were, you know, agency is one of the key things that solutions journalism delivers, is how people get their own power back and they're not passive, that they can do things to turn their situations around. You know, and that was the story that we told. We got amazing feedback, you know, and I've been, you know, Bill Shorten's, I can't tell you how many times he's supposed to be traveling to Longreach to see it for himself, but he's had various things like COVID and other things that have come up in his way. But I mean, that's a classic example of telling a story. You know, the first crack at it, we had this woman buzzing around in her town in her electronic wheelchair saying that was the only thing that she could do because she had nothing else to do with her time. And yet there was another story to tell. We just had to dig a little deeper.
But I guess the point I wanted to say by raising that was the original story affected you, but it didn't really. I kind of felt it had a debilitating effect, and I feel in my own journalism with investigative stuff, it can be very serious and hard, but you walk away from it sometimes and go, that was really depressing, you know, and what use was this information that I put together? And that's simply why I kind of started to pivot to doing solutions/constructive journalism.
It's easy, and it's easy to tell. Everyone's got a story of misery. Everyone, and that's an easy story to tell, but how people are turning things around and bucking the trend, they're not easy stories to tell. They're a little bit hard to find, especially if you want data to back up what people are doing. You know, they aren't, arguably sometimes they're harder stories to find.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. And I think this point about gathering the data and gathering the evidence, and doing so to a point where it doesn't just happen in Longreach, but people somewhere else feel that they have enough information from the story to think, we could try that here. We might need to adjust it, but we would, so, you know, you're providing people with enough information to think, what are the limitations of a particular response to a problem? So thinking about these 4 pillars of a solution story of what's the response, how does it work, what is the evidence and data to support that it's a useful response to the problem, and also what are its limitations, so that something that works in Longreach might also work in Kalgoorlie, or it might not.
That's how, sorry to interrupt there too. That's how I also like to illustrate with people that this is different. Sometimes people go, oh, what you're talking about is good news. No, good news, or, you know, is the water skiing squirrel in the backyard pool, for example. That might make you feel good for like 5 seconds. But a constructive story where you're talking about how people have overcome issues, that they've tackled a problem and they're making a solution of it or fixing a problem and how they've gone about it, psychologically, the story is different. It plants a seed of hope in people, thinking that those people haven't been helpless. They've actually done something to help themselves. And that's where it's different. And that's where those solution stories give people, and I hate the word agency, but it gives them a sense of power, that they're not powerless, that they can do something about it.
Thank you. I might also share an example. In the past, I worked for a period of time with BBC Media Action, which is a media development organisation in the UK. And one of their programs is called Lifeline. And when I mean programs, I mean a project that is rolled out in different contexts, typically after a conflict or natural disaster. And there's a number of elements within that kind of coverage. So it's initial natural disaster coverage. So where do I go for fresh water? Where do I go for tarpaulins? Where can I continue to get access to education for my kids? That evolves over time into stories of hope and resilience. So it's, we've rebuilt this or we've restored this. And it's based on research that finds that people need those stories to have a strong sense of positive morale, which they need in those situations to just get through them. And I might just quickly touch on the point you've made there, Sabra, about the providing balance so that it's not the full picture if we're only focusing on the negative. And I do really love the title of the Solutions Journalism Network blog, which is the whole story. It's this part of it, but also this. Just one last example, perhaps, when we're thinking about implementation. I live in the Illawarra in Darawal land, and we just recently had horrendous floods. So the worst floods since the mid-90s. And so I was going to my local news to find out. I'm not often affected by natural disasters, so this was a rare situation for me. Just to find out what had happened that had gone wrong. And I got that from the regular news services, and to a lesser extent from the regular news, but a lot on social media. I was getting, where can I help? Where can I donate? How can I be of service to my community? And that made me think there's something in that. I'm not sure what it is, but it just seemed to be a very interesting opportunity for traditional newsrooms to fill a gap that I personally felt in that situation. We might trundle back to the slides if that's okay, but we do have lots of time, friends, for Q&A at the end, so please do start thinking about your questions for Sabra and Drew. Just going to go and share my screen. Excellent. Hopefully you can see that. So becoming a solutions journalism champion in your newsroom, how do we start this process if it's all new or we haven't really done very much? So who is a potential champion? It might be two broad categories here. It might be, if you're a top-down process of finding these people, so you might be an editor or a manager, look for who's doing solution stories already, or perhaps come and said, oh, you know what, that was a really grim series that we did, but there's these folks that are doing something that's in response to it. That might be your potential champion. Who's put a hand up for training or shown interest? They might be a potential champion. But also thinking about this from a business perspective, which genres would resonate best with your audience that might be, as we saw, with arts, education, science, or health, for example, which genres would resonate the best with your audience? And would that team potentially be interested in being your early adopters? And then bottom up, if you want to become a champion, it's been done quite often of, I suppose, takeover by stealth, which is produce your content and then share the impact internally. So understand the potential impact that it can have and capture that. And in fact, our session next month, are we still in May? July, our July session, we'll be looking at the impact of solutions journalism and how to capture that. We have special guests from an organisation called Impact Architects. That's what they do for a living. And then share that impact internally. Perhaps ask your line manager, could I have a KPI around this? What is the wider business impact that you might share? So perhaps you have an internal facing newsletter or an intranet. Say, you know what, I've done this. This is the outcome it had. This is the impact it had. This is my email address. Give me a hoy if you would like to learn more. But also to share your impact externally. The research into audience engagement and revenue generation has found that you do also need to let the audience know that this is different content, that if it's just sitting alongside everything else on your homepage, it's not as useful a target as it is if it's flagged. This is something different that we're doing. You can flag that for your audience, and you can also flag it for your sources of revenue. So let your advertisers know, let your sponsors know, let your philanthropists know, pitch for grants that will support this kind of work so that it sits somewhere that's visible as a new product. It's a new editorial product. Just going to go through some ambassadors that have been identified in the US. I was quite interested in how different media outlets in the States have been approaching this. So the case studies that we had earlier, these are the people who are driving that work at those outlets. So at the Richland Source, which as we know was a solutions-focused newsroom, their solutions journalism ambassador, for want of a better word, might be a small a. I don't think that's actually her job title. She is their engagement editor. So her role, it's a good choice for that role because she has an impact reporting responsibility across audience, business, and editorial. She's a Solutions Journalism Network accredited trainer. There are now a few of those here in Australia. I'm one. There's Catherine Roth in Adelaide, and there's a couple of others, I think, coming up. So there's a growing number of Australians who have the ability to run accreditation training if your business wants to do that. She has to keep solutions journalism top of mind for the business. That's part of her job. She advocates for solution stories because we are trying to break habits. And she supports staff awareness and training so that it's practice, not a project. And they're beginning to think about how do we do this on short turnaround stories, which are harder. But the view there is that practice will make perfect, or at least closer to perfect. At the Montana Free Press, the Solutions Ambassador is Nate Schoenfelder. So he's the Audience Engagement Director. And so his task there has been looking into things like addressing staff concerns about, is this going to mean extra work? We work in an industry where we're often asked to do more for the same or less. So just forward managing for that risk has been important. Arranging the conversations and discussions to support a shift in culture, supporting the training, and also thinking about what are the key takeaways. So what's the, understanding that there's actually a high appeal of solutions journalism to reporters and capitalizing on that across the business, and also the high appeal to audiences. They've found that it has led to a stronger top of funnel for revenue. So making that clear across the business has been part of his role. At the Dallas Morning News, so Tom Huang is their assistant managing editor for news. And what they've been looking for, if you remember, was solutions journalism angles. And so his role is identifying solutions journalism opportunities, which they acknowledge is difficult for fast or daily turnaround stories. So there they've been focusing what are the off-diary project stories and really surfacing those for the business. At the Flint Beat, the ambassador there is Kate Stockram, so she's the associate editor. They're a very small news outlet. The team as a whole chose to implement solution stories, and so individuals self-selected as ambassadors. And so Kate's job is to oversee the rollout, set role-specific goals, and what they have found is that they are learning together as they go together. They're also moving towards making this an ongoing practice rather than individual projects, and that there's a need to slow down. That although solutions journalism stories can take longer, the dividends are higher with that longer time investment on engagement and revenue. So just beginning to think less is more, because we do operate in a very high speed industry. So I might just come to you both now before we move on to action plan. I'll just stop the share for a moment. Drew, do you see yourself as an ambassador or a champion at Al Jazeera? How would you describe
I'm not sure if I would classify myself as that. But what I do try to do is introduce new storytelling techniques, whether it's digital and online or as 25-minute documentaries. And during the pandemic lockdown, it gave me a lot of time to read a lot and kind of look at some of the principles. So yeah, I mean, and I think what is great about this learning process is there's so many great video resources out there where you can go for a long walk and listen to a talk from Perugia or somewhere else to kind of get your mind into how to tell these stories with a more optimistic kind of frame of mind. So
I might just jump in just for a second for context. I think perhaps folks may not be familiar with the work that you've done at Al Jazeera, but you've created a couple of really beautiful, important pieces. One is mindset and the other one is a sense of community. Could you just maybe just provide a bit of background on those for participants to contextualize your ambassadorial role, if you like?
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, to kind of explain the two projects in a very succinct way for the purposes of this webinar, a sense of the community we put out, the year that the world opened back up, because we saw during the pandemic that lots of people were, deeply more engaged with their immediate neighborhood and suburb. And this was still Omicron. It was very hard to travel. So we thought if we were trapped anywhere, be trapped in a neighborhood, because so that was one of the rationales behind the series. But it was also, the news was wall-to-wall bleakness at the time, and the rationale behind a sense of community was to profile 4 very unique suburbs or neighborhoods that were addressing global problems. Like, for example, the very first episode was about a satellite neighborhood called Iztapalapa on the outskirts of Mexico City. And obviously a lot of media has done stories on gang crime and violence and stuff. And what we did was we featured a female mayor who was addressing domestic violence in Iztapalapa by lighting up dark streets and creating utopias to create more family cohesion and more safe spaces for people to be. So what we did was we looked at crime stats and stuff and looked at, instead of looking at where the ganglands are, we looked at, well, where are the improvements in Mexico? And just to be clear, we didn't just kind of platform the mayor. We also still looked at challenges that remain, like water access in this neighborhood remained an issue, and people had to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. But because, every country of the world has a crime affected neighborhood or a place you fear to tread, Iztapalapa was one of those neighborhoods where they were turning both domestic violence and street crime around. So that was one example of episodes that were shot around the world, and they were spearheaded by a local filmmaker. And to find 4 filmmakers to make it, we actually reached out to 70 filmmakers. Our starting point is, what's a neighborhood that makes you proud to be a member of your country? And then we started introducing some of those solutions questions that were in the earlier webinars to kind of draw out, because in some of these countries, solutions journalism wasn't an idea. So we had to kind of gently, through email after email, make them realize the solutions journalism components in the neighborhood which they really like and think is a good reflection of what's happening in their country. So that was what a sense of community was about. Mindset, in short, it was a 7-part digital series looking at how different countries around the world address mental health, everything from intense therapy in Argentina to traditional healers in South Africa to using technology in Denmark, antidepressants in Iceland, magic mushrooms in Jamaica. So basically we kind of looked at all these different approaches and saw how, culturally people accepted it, the problems that they had, and how they used these kind of mental health solutions to address their own needs.
Thank you so much. And in terms of your work within Al Jazeera, would you see that you've been perhaps a pocket of innovation, or have you been joining a bandwagon that was already in motion, or how would you see that in terms of an ambassadorial or a champion of the approach role?
I mean, Al Jazeera has done solutions journalism since 2011 with shows like Earthrise, which looks at environmental solutions. Some of our interview shows as well kind of platform youth leaders in different countries that are doing innovating things. They talk about the problems, but they also talk about the solutions that they're doing to address some of those kind of problems that affect youth in different countries around the world. So we have been doing it, but probably I think that there has been a massive shift, and I do think in our editorial meetings now, perhaps we don't say, as the previous slides indicated, is there a solutions focus to this? We may not use such formal language, but we go, well, up until the 15-minute mark, you've talked about the problem or you've explained the issue. We really need to see what have been the efforts to try and solve this at the very least. Otherwise, what's the next shift in the story? Why would people invest in the next 10 to 20 minutes of the documentary? So it's what I think is I think, we do get filmmakers pitch to us very, very bleak stories, and we go, honestly, would you watch this for 20 minutes? Like, we need to find a way that makes it a little bit more appealing. We don't diminish the issue. We just kind of go, you need to go back to the drawing board. And, I think academic papers are a remarkable source of solutions, case studies, or, NGO reports with little breakout boxes that kind of talk about the policy. So we kind of give them guidance on where to find those kind of more optimistic components of the story.
Thank you so much. And I guess some of the things that you're suggesting there, or some of the processes that you've built or developing informally, are the sorts of things that perhaps if a news outlet wanted to implement solutions journalism as an approach, you might have a almost like a tip sheet for how to file stories for our outlet, or the ones that you have existing might be edited. Does that make sense? As in, back in the day, I was a freelancer, and you would get a how to pitch to us, how to write to us guide, for example, and those sorts of documents might benefit from a review, for instance.
Yeah, but I also think it goes back to podcasts and videos as well. Like, I'm dealing as well with global South filmmakers whose English may not be their first language. So sometimes a tips sheet is not the best way to kind of get that kind of pivot in the way they see a story. Sometimes it's more illustrative, like showing them a story we've done and gone, we followed this Nepalese eye doctor, and can you see we still talked about the serious issue, but we kind of crafted it in a way that showed that people aren't just passive populations enduring the problem. They are actually doing something. And, showing, not necessarily telling through fact sheets, is another way that I kind of get across some of those solutions journalism messaging to people who don't know how to go about it.
Thanks so much. Sabra, at the ABC, would you see what the sorts of projects you're doing? This might be a great moment to talk about a couple of them, and then we can follow that up with some thoughts around championing, ambassador creation, etc. So,
yeah, well, I got off the ground nearly 3 years ago, a newsletter specifically to subscribers, pointing them towards the more sort of solutions focused reporting that we're doing at the ABC. I've been putting that out every fortnight. And it was interesting at the start. Our marketing people, I wanted to know, they didn't want me to send out the first one until we had an audience big enough to send it out to. So I asked them to give me some guidance. How long would that take? And they said, oh, look, the business newsletter, it took them about 6-7 weeks to get an audience base big enough to send out the first one. I did some very, very basic promos for it, the Brightside newsletter, and we had that audience within 24 hours. So I think that told management from the get-go that there was already a strong appetite from our audience to be doing something differently. We've just done a trial podcast too, based on the same thing, the Bright Side. We did 5 weeks worth, a weekly episode put out roughly 25 minutes in length. We highlighted some of the more solutions-oriented reporting that was happening at the ABC. I also tried to do an interview in the mix as well, someone who was doing something differently. For example, we featured Glenn Keys in one of those interviews. A lot of Australians know him, especially in Canberra, as being ACT Australian of the Year, and he's very much identified as being the CEO of Aspen Medical, a company that does a lot of fly-in, fly-out medical work here in Australia and overseas. What many people don't know is that he's got a foundation together called Project Independence, where he's building homes for disabled people to, buy their own homes, to pay off mortgages like every other Australian, to try and get their own homes. And that basically started because he's got a son with Down syndrome who wanted to buy his own home. And he thought, yeah, why can't he have the same own, desire for a home like everyone else? And then they visited a community group that was doing supported accommodation in ACT, and he really liked it. And he said, can we get my son's name on the list? And the organizer said, yeah, sure, but it'll be based on the numbers we've got on the list at the moment. He'd be probably about 50 years off getting his own place. So Glenn thought there must be something different to be doing here. So that's why he got that project off the ground. They've now built, I think, 3 homes, Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney, and they're adjusting the model now to build homes for women over 50 who found themselves without accommodation on their own, wanting to get their own home. So, I mean, that was a great story to be told. And it was really interesting because at the end of that interview, he thanked me and said, in all my time in doing what I've done, no one's actually asked to do an interview with me about this work, which I thought was extraordinary. But, that is an example of the kind of thing that we're talking about as well. That podcast is now going to be rolling out from the mid next month on a weekly basis, because the success that we've seen in audience numbers too, there is an appetite for this kind of journalism.
And so do you feel now, having done these kinds of projects, and I know the ABC also did a little while back, the Who's Going to Save Us climate podcast.
Yep.
So Joel Werner and the, I think, Triple J Hack team put that one together, which was also solutions focused. So there are these pockets of adoption. And I guess the question then is how a news outlet moves towards sort of a more formal scaling up of an approach.
Right. And that's where it comes down to the editorial discussions that every newsroom has. We recently also had some training through the Solutions Journalism Network about how we can incorporate this into what we do on a daily basis, that it's not just siloed, because, it needs to be part of what we do day in, day out. It's part of my practice in AM. Like, I rewrite intros. I look at questions. If I've got a politician on the program, I don't think, gee, what does the gallery really want answered here? I really think of, the audience. What are the questions they want to know here? The first question I had to Immigration Minister this morning was, many Australians will be wondering, why do you still have a job? Quite frankly, that's what many Australians are wondering. So I often will take that approach to introductions. I don't want to sound like the voice of God. That was journalism 10 more years ago. Some people still speak that way, but it's just, I want to be engaging. I want to feel like people, I'm talking to them. A lot of people from the research that's been done overseas One of the reasons they give to avoiding news consumption is that they feel that we talk down to them or we don't answer their questions, that we speak to them in a language that they don't understand. So sometimes they might look at a bulletin or listen to a bulletin and feel like we've just presented to them series 7, episode 4, and they don't know what's gone before. We shouldn't think that, gee, well, the public should keep up to date with this. We need to incorporate it in what we do. We need to be explaining every day what we're doing, not use acronyms that I constantly get frustrated with copy where people write, and this came to me as a promo one day. The ACCC is cracking down on, there was another acronym and 3 acronyms in one promo line. And I was thinking, the ordinary punter, what are they to think of that? Like, they listen to that and think, I don't know what they're talking about. I'm not going to listen. That's the easiest decision for them to make. It's like what Drew was saying earlier. Why should I invest the next 5 minutes of my precious time listening to what you've got to tell me?
And I think it's, so much about solutions approaches, constructive approaches. When I was at the International Journalism Festival recently in Perugia, I met a researcher from Canada who's working on an approach which is called conciliatory journalism, which is thinking about how do we build more constructive ways of covering Indigenous stories, which I'm looking forward to reading more about. And I think it's, as we evolve the way that we think about storytelling, these new avenues open up. I might, if I may, just pop back into the deck and then turn fully over to a Q&A in about 5 minutes. And we're starting to get some questions in the Q&A box, which is great. If you have questions, there's a few now, so I'll pop into all of those very shortly. Just wanted to wrap this up, which is thinking about an action plan. So how do we get from go to woe, as it were? How do we develop an action plan to begin and expand solutions journalism in the newsroom? So first of all, training. Both Sabra and Drew, you've talked about the importance of training. Sabra, you've talked about how amenable the Solutions Journalism Network is to running training for newsrooms, and I would absolutely support that. It's also possible to connect with the Constructive Institute, which has a sort of a branch or chapter in Melbourne now. So there's the opportunity to get this kind of training. And I've worked as a trainer for many years myself, and so I've observed as an external provider, if you book a training person and then they come and leave, you really do need to think, even before you've booked that training, how would we get from information to implementation? So, I could come and show somebody how to use a video editing software program or whatever, but if they don't then go off and use it, they'll forget. And so without a plan, it can feel like a bridge to not really anywhere. And then if you have a plan, you think, actually, I just have to take a short jump to the next step. So if you're a leader, I was thinking about what are the points that have taken away from the overseas case studies, the case studies that we've got here in Australia. So first of all, make training materials easy to access and refer to. So if you're starting to, if you've had some training, book it. If you haven't, book it. But once you've got it, just make it easy for people to find. And that means also building it into your onboarding, for example. Identify your early adopters. And I think what we're also taking away from the experiences of people like Sabra, like Drew, and overseas, that you need a mixture of people who make decisions and then people who produce content. When you're working with, middle layer editors, they're very much the people who decide on a day-to-day basis what goes out. And they're horrendously busy usually. So keeping your guidance really clear, really simple, to think about what gets covered, can this also get covered, how it gets covered, could it get covered, including this approach, and be open to the conversations around resource prioritization, which is what we saw from Nate in the States, is having those conversations around less for more or less is more. Think about a couple of early career people. They may be recent graduates, and you might like to ask, did anybody do a solutions journalism unit when you were at university, because more universities are now incorporating this into the into what they're teaching, and a couple of high-profile reporters. And I think this is something I've observed over many years in terms of innovation introductions across many things. For example, at RTE, the national broadcaster in Ireland, when they wanted to adopt mobile journalism, they asked one of their most senior radio reporters to have a go at it. Someone who's respected across the business, and everyone looks up to that person. And so if they're interested in it, lots of other people who want to be that person when they grow up, when they've got their next job, they think, oh, I'll do it because Kieran's doing it. And people who are keen to innovate. So those were just some thoughts from me. Also discussing with your teams, setting SMART goals. I love a good SMART goal: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, has a deadline on it, timely. Think about a stop, start, continue, these processes that help us not always add more to the list without taking something away. Building your impact metrics in. Everyone likes to feel like they've made progress. It's nice to be able to have some figures to look at. So our session 6 in July will look at overall impact. Our session 2 looked at revenue impact, and the third session on audience engagement will help you with tools and approaches to deliver that. So if you think about this series from the foundation as a whole, you'll be able to identify some processes to get impact metrics in. And then think how you're going to talk about this within the business and then also externally to the business. Those are your steps. And the slide deck is available on our site after this session, so you'll be able to map out your journey. These are the sorts of questions that, Sabra, you were talking about when you're rewriting intros or adding an extra question, the sorts of questions that you need to just build into the day-to-day process of news gathering. Since I became a solutions journalism trainer in 2022, and ever since then, I get to the end of a hard news story and I'm just looking for a paragraph that says, and what could I do about this? Or how could I get involved in this? And it sits, as I've been in journalism for 30 years. And so it sits a little uncomfortably with the old public broadcaster that says I shouldn't be part of the story. Do you know what I mean? It's that sort of balance.
But it's also,
how can I empower the audience to ask those questions?
It's also one of the easiest questions you can ask a talent at the end of the interview is what practical assistance would help you right now? Right? Mm-hmm. And often you might be surprised by the answer. I gave one of our cadets some advice a couple of months ago about what could help you right now. And he ended up confessing the next day that question is what gave him the lead to his story. So, you might be pleasantly surprised. And I always want to challenge, and sorry for jumping in there, just because it's a solution story too doesn't mean that you bury the solution to the bottom part of the story. Like, I think that people really need to rethink how they structure stories, full stop. We ran, and this is going back some time ago, EP said, I'm stuck for a story today. We haven't got a hard news yarn. And I said, we have. We had a really good story from Marion Farr about a program that had been working with defence veterans who had PTSD and had been taking them back to their sources of where they got post-traumatic stress disorder. And this particular program had taken a veteran back to Timor, where he kept going back and back and back. And he ended up finding the love of his life there and getting married and settling there. And that was, an extreme example, but why not tell it? We tell extreme examples of every other story every day. So we ended up leading our program with that. We tell you we've had Defence Royal Commissions and whatnot, but this is a program that's actually recording some success. Let's hear how it's working.
Do you want to add to that, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, just listening to what you were saying, and how to one of the things when I look at the slides is how do you actually begin on this journey, or however you want to do it. And I think, you know, when you look at some of the earlier presentations, you see the framework, you learn it, you recognize it, but like, don't feel pressured to kind of implement it all at once. Like, I'm a jazz musician, I trained in jazz music. You learn the scales and then you be creative with it. But by learning the theory, you can apply it in different ways. And I think you the primary goal is to better your journalism and to create something more nuanced. And to get editors on side, maybe a good way to kind of start that solutions journalism journey is to build upon your existing reporting that perhaps was acclaimed or well received, but lacked a constructive solution. That's one way that I've been able to get people to change their attitude to doing a story, or not going, well, this one went well, but we didn't really tell the audience how to solve it. And I think, you know, people say don't start within your comfort zone, but I feel for constructive journalism, don't attempt to tackle completely new foreign subject matter to you and put a solutions lens on it. I think you need to have a degree of comfort and control over what you're doing, and that's mastery of a beat, a town, whatever is your strength. Use the constructive journalism kind of approach to complement it. If you're a great court reporter, you do have credibility telling a story on how to change the system or featuring figures within the system that are making that change. And I also think you need to find points in the story to be authentically you if you're on camera or telling the story, or upbeat. You know, like, not present, like, the big mistake I see in bad solutions reporting is presenting it in this kind of labored didactic way. So I think, you know, there are ways to do it. But the ways to get people on side is, think, if you're going to do a series, for example, perhaps like the first story is not the best story, but it sets the tone of the you know, the solutions beats that you're going to hit in every other story. Like, I feel with the mindset series I did, the first episode wasn't the best one. It just kind of presented the challenge and had a very conventional way of dealing with it. So yeah, look, I even think, you know, when you look at the big stories today, like Gaza or Ukraine, like big humanitarian disasters where it seems like all is futile, you know, history does tend to repeat itself. And there are people that kind of, you look at Iraq and you look at Syria, there are people who have rebuilt those countries. And, you know, sometimes you've got to draw upon history to find those solutions angles to things that would traditionally be quite bleak. I know when I started, it's hard to see it, but the only way to do it, like with a guitar or a piano, is to practice, to try. Sometimes you'll succeed, sometimes it might seem a bit naff, but you only are going to do it well by having a red hot go at it.
So
Drew,
true.
just to riff off that, I often say to my colleagues here, we're aiming for progress, not perfection. You know, we might get there one day, but, you know, every step that we make in that direction, I think, is a good one.
I think it's so true. And it echoes the experience of newsrooms that have been implementing these approaches all over the world, is little by little, day by day. Don't be too preachy about it, I think, is also part of it. One of the organizations that I'll just make sure that I add it to our handout for today is the Bonn Institute in Germany. And that's been a very interesting project where it's not specifically solutions or constructive, it's just a journalism first institute that is looking at building in storytelling approaches that respond to an audience need for hope and agency. And I know it's that kind of a word, Sabra, but it's a very useful word. Yeah. We're nearly done with the slides, and then we'll turn to the Q&A. You may. So if you're an individual, we've talked about steps, action plan, steps for a leader. If you're an individual, know what solutions journalism is and what it isn't, and that's covered off in session 1 of this series. I would encourage to investigate parallel approaches like constructive journalism, have a look at the Bond Institute, start adding these questions to your interviews. Just a very, if that's the thinnest edge of your wedge, is to ask, how could have this been done better? What evidence have you got? What would someone need to know to try this out? What are the limitations of what you're doing? Those 4 questions will start to generate those angles. Take 5 extra minutes. Just schedule a follow-up. I've just covered something that's hard news and depressing. Depressing because it's disempowering. And I think, Sabra, you talked at the beginning about news avoidance. I also find that phrase, it's a little bit like saying, I've opened a restaurant and no one's coming. And you go, well, but no one likes that kind of food. So whose fault's that? We do need to diversify the menu, I think. So just take that 5 extra minutes to think, is there a solutions angle follow-up to this? Have a look around. I've reported on something that's a problem. Is anyone trying to do anything about this? You can also ask the audience. So, we've been reporting on this. What have you seen? And I don't want to imply that people aren't doing this already. I do see a lot of newsrooms and individual journalists doing this a lot. And so this certainly isn't new for a lot of you who are on this webinar or who'll be watching it or taking an interest in it. You'll be like, oh, I'm doing that already. And if you are, great. Then it might be a thinking about how do you formalize some of the processes around this to build it into your newsroom in a sustainable way that makes sure that it's part of onboarding, learning and organizational development, it survives churn, and all the rest of it. If you're new to this or you're doing the new work, perhaps you could ask your editor, is my work suitable to be used as a pilot? And then start to look at allies across your business, creating that coalition of the willing. These are some of the resources that I'll put into today's handout. I do quite like this one from the Fix. If you like newsletters, they've got a newsletter course, which is running at the moment. European Journalism Centre put some energy into a solutions journalism guide. It's short, sweet PDF. You could stick it on the fridge. There is a learning lab that's part of the Solutions Journalism Network landing page. And quite a few of the resources from today are from a very recent webinar that the SJN ran on building a solutions journalism culture in your newsroom. So if you want to watch that in more detail, you can. And then there's a nice big thick handbook for constructive journalism. So that's slightly different form from International Media Service, which is available. So I'm going to stop the share. We do have some wonderful questions, which I'll go to first before starting mine, because that's polite. First one is, and I won't name people in case people don't want their names in the recordings, but how do you try to avoid cliched resilient communities angles? So this person is from a place which gets flooded regularly, and resilience is, quote, not a word that plays too well, end quote. So Drew, you were talking about not treating reporting on people as passive, for example, but we can sometimes swing to different kinds of language that perhaps, the great Aussie battler type thing, it's perhaps not very useful. How do you approach describing communities?
Well, to navigate that issue that's raised in that question, I mean, I do think you've got to find characters or a structure that kind of turns that concept of the cliched resilient community on its head. You need someone, a character, doing something interesting or active to draw you into the story, or someone, if there is no one like that, someone that has such unique insight from that from that kind of constant of being in the flood zone, that they start your story in a way that makes the audience think of this issue in a completely different way. It's not always easy, but even if it was a first person narrative, whether it was a radio doc or a TV thing, sometimes I would say to them, a person in the question, how do you feel seeing communities like yours being presented as these resilient communities and it often draws a really interesting answer that kind of lures the audience into the narrative. So I hope that answers your question. That would be how I would approach that kind of idea of that kind of portrayal always of these, these towns that are always in the disaster zone as, battlers and communities, and we'll get through, avoid the sound bites that, are cliches, like it was like a war zone. It comes down to, I think, really good interviewing as well to kind of navigate around the cliches that may exist when you present communities the way they often are.
I think one of the things too around one of the qualities that is not a solutions journalism story is hero worship, right? So when the story should focus on the response rather than the individual, and that can help avoid these, gravitating towards particular kind of characters to the point where they almost become caricatures, to say it's really about the response that's happening to people just like you, actually, except they live here. Yeah, Sabra?
Could I just pick up a point that Drew made then about, describing something as a war zone? I also counsel people to, think carefully about what they're writing. Sometimes it's really easy to pluck out that cliche because you're running up against a deadline and that's the thing that comes to mind. But recently we had some examples of war cliches being used in sports stories. And, at the moment, it's just not relevant. They're not relevant. They're tired. We've got real wars happening. And I just think, and I know I'm being blunt, but I think that's just lazy journalism, and just take another 30 seconds and think about it a little bit longer and, be a bit more constructive about what you're writing.
By a thesaurus.
Yeah, by a thesaurus, and just think about what you're saying. What are you trying to say? There's a way of saying it without using war analogy,
Absolutely. Sabra, I'm going to put the next question to you, if I may. What do you feel is the difference between investigative journalism and solutions-based journalism?
Well, there isn't really. I often think that a good solution story is an investigative piece, especially if you've got the data around it as well and you're explaining the limitations of something. It's really good investigative journalism, I think. It's probably more holistic journalism rather than just exposing a problem. You're looking at how it's being tackled.
Yeah. True.
Just to add, all I would say, because I actually work in Al Jazeera's investigative unit, but do solutions stories. What I would say is solutions journalism can go really well hand in hand with not just investigative journalism, but explain the content, not, describing the problem and then going meet blah, and they're trying to do it this way. And they do go hand in hand. But to answer that question, I would say when an editor sets you out to do an investigative piece, they expect you to find something new, like a document, or use hidden cameras to expose some form of criminality, or you need to come back with something new with an investigation. That's kind of a basic expectation on a commission. With this, when I'm commissioned to do a solution story, your editor will often ask you to look at the issue in a different way, or have a community that shows that issue in a different light. It doesn't exactly produce like a smoking gun or something that changes the face of the issue, but it perhaps a solution story perhaps makes you think a little bit differently about that issue. And that kind of runs into one of the questions that's coming up.
Thank you. We can all see the chat. And there's quite a long question here, which I will summarize a little bit, I think, which is overcoming resistance to solutions journalism. When you're trying to get buy-in, I suppose, from an editor, and it's around the pitching. So how does one overcome resistance to solutions journalism and get that buy-in? And then also, how might that feed into what you're pitching? It's a bit of a complicated question. Take a moment.
I mean, there was quite a resistance to solutions journalism, I'd say years ago here, because people mistakenly thought it was either campaign advocacy or, soft, fluffy journalism. Usually people I find who are resistant to solutions journalism don't know what they're talking about. I don't like using, you probably guessed this already, I don't really like using the solutions or the constructive approach. I know that they are different forms, but because you just get an automatic sort of pushback, I mean, I just don't like talking about it, full stop. I think it's a more holistic journalism, full stop. If you're getting resistance from someone, I'd say go to another editor. Continue, because you'll find someone who is all ears and they want to hear something different. That's been, I mean, my experience has been to push on, to keep going, because I mean, certainly the feedback from the audience has been very strong. They have a very strong appetite for it. So
if we turn to community demand, and I suppose I guess one of the challenges, if it's not a solutions or a constructive or something, is coming up with a way of communicating this is a different thing that we're doing that marks it out as a product. Is that something that you think the ABC might explore, or it's a how does one without putting you on the spot, how does one differentiate this content in a way that makes it cohesive as an offering to an audience? And Drew, you might also want to jump in there.
I guess, I mean, as I pointed out earlier, I mean, we are sort of collating stuff, curating it and saying, here is a lot of it. I mean, of journalism that we're doing that ticks that sort of box at the ABC. But it is becoming more organic in more of our reporting. I can certainly say that with AM. You know, when I first presented the program in 2017, I wouldn't say that much of what we were doing then would be described as constructive, whereas now, you know, we often do 1 or 2 stories a day that would sort of tick that box, if you like.
Yeah, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, in the way that we market our solutions journalism content, it is in the social media promotion, it is in the advertising that this is going to be a series that looks at solutions. I mean, it perhaps it says it in a more simple term of phrase, but we do kind of imprint that solutions on it. But if I can just add very quickly to the long question that's in the chat, just a bit of advice to that person, an editor that says, oh, it would never work here. I think basically in the structure with a lot of solution stories, you've got to go wide at some point and go, if you're looking at like a unique, you know, Filipino environmentalist that's doing something unique with plastic pollution, you've got to go wide and go why this guy's approach matters to the world. You know, 8 of the top 10 Asian nations are the worst plastic polluters on the planet. It's kind of like those 2 or 3 elevator pitch lines to kind of make the audience care about what they're watching. Somewhere in the story, you've got to kind of go wide and go, this is why what this person is doing is an interesting kind of contribution to a global problem.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions now, so we will wrap up in 14 minutes at the 90-minute mark. So we'll get through the ones that we have in the chat. So there are 2 questions about sources and communities. One is just a general question about the kinds of responses that you're getting from sources and communities that you're covering, and from audiences, whether it's changing your relationships, and in particular, or as well, whether there's a particular kind of response or reaction where there's a diversity inclusion element to it. For example, if you're reporting slightly differently or differently on multicultural communities, gender communities, etc. How does this change the relationship of the between newsrooms and the people that live in the communities that we cover, broadly speaking?
I mean, yeah, you tend to, I mean, I tend to find that our engagement has been strengthened with communities that we've been doing this kind of work with. And certainly it sort of builds that element of trust. And that's sort of a sentiment I've heard echoed elsewhere. I think it does build trust because we're prepared to talk to them about how they're tackling issues and, not presenting their communities as something stereotypical. So yeah, I mean, that's my experience. I tend to find that our engagement with them is strengthened. Yeah, and it builds trust, and we need more of that. We know that trust is a problem that is confronting big institutions, including media organisations.
Drew?
Using the Mexico story that I mentioned earlier as an example, so this mayor was creating these like parks where people could access free sport programs and free arts programs. And we actually did, with the help of the filmmaker, we did a screening in one of these utopias where the community came and watched the film, and the people that were featured in the film, including like Mexico's Kate Blanchett runs free drama workshops in the utopia. They all came and watched a couple of the screenings. So that we did that to make people feel ownership of the process. But it also went badly in another way, in the sense that the mayor also did a screening of the film at Parliament House and showed her constituents and people what she's done. And at first it made me feel icky, but the documentary did contain a lot of problems that was still to be fixed in the community. So I felt we didn't make a corporate video for her, and we didn't we showed the good and the bad, and we showed the challenges that people still face. So look, I mean, you, like with any piece of media, you can't, however the audience uses it, it's how they use it. But constructive journalism, it does show at the very least that it does resonate with people, and people do use it to kind of say, this is who I am, this is what our life is, this is who we are. And that's why I'm a real, acolyte of it as a journalistic approach.
There's some great questions here. I think one of them, Drew, speaks very much to when you were doing the series on mental health, you were looking at responses to mental health challenges in very different contexts and cultures. So there's a question here. It's going back over this question of parochialism, and it's more around, perhaps finding it difficult to get buy-in here in Australia into responses that have been made overseas. So, for example, what happens outside of Australia might not work here. How would you perhaps build that into your storytelling if you came across something that you thought, and I know you're not a mental health professional, but you thought there might be relevance to an Australian audience of a solution overseas or a response overseas? How do you get around that parochialism, if it exists?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, with mindset, I should add that none of the approaches themselves were demonized in any way, including antidepressants for Iceland. I think they're the highest user of antidepressants in Europe. It's a system that works for that country because a lot of people live rural, a lot of people live a long way from doctors. I mean, with that series, it was very difficult. Like, it wasn't for a national broadcaster like the ABC. It was for a global broadcaster. So I was very careful in choosing like a Latin American episode, an African episode, so people felt represented, because the audience was responses like, oh, this is not how we do it in Africa, and we were able to kind of write in the comments, well, stay tuned for episode 5 because we're going to look at the challenges in South Africa. That's how, as a global broadcaster, we created that inclusivity. If I was to make this product for an American broadcaster or an Australian broadcaster, the approach would probably be different. I haven't really thought about it in that way, but I probably would have components that I would have filmed in Australia per se that show where the blockages are and, how it works there. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's a silver bullet and it would necessarily work. Like, every kind of episode of Mindset kind of showed why it worked for that culture. And that's why I felt it worked as a series, because we weren't trying to say any approach was better than another. It was just more like we all think mental health is simply going and seeing a clinician, when it's way more complicated than that. So yeah, I mean, that's how I'd answer that question.
Sabra, do you want to add?
Yeah, look, and you know, that's one of the things to be mindful of as well. And I know that Ulrich Hogger talks about at the Constructive Institute that if you're doing a constructive story, that's one of the things you need to ask. Would this work? If this solution in Hobart, would it work in Perth? Would it work in Adelaide? If it doesn't, you know, there's no benefit in those places running the story. But that's certainly something that you need to be mindful of when you're doing those stories, when you're talking about limitations.
There's a couple of questions here. One is solutions journalism an in-house term, and should we use different terms to an audience, and what might be some audience-friendly terms? Honestly, I'm going to suggest that you ask your audience. I think it is, in terms of studying an approach, it is useful, I think, to understand here is an approach, here is what it looks like when it's done in a sort of formal way. Does that work for us? Some elements of it might, some elements might not. But ultimately, you know, your audience, the community that you're connecting with, determine your use of language, right? Like if you're broadcasting to children, for example, you won't say this is a solutions journalism thing for your kids. It'll be something different. And similarly, if you're you know, your demographic is not an English language speaking audience, then you will come up with something that works in that language. So just try and be audience driven would be my tip.
Yeah. I think people really get hooked up unnecessarily on this. You know, what solutions, what's constructive should we be using? It's not rocket science. Like I said at the start, we do breaking news really well. We do investigative news really well. It's holistic journalism. It's the next, what's next? How are people fixing these problems? It's that simple.
Yeah, true.
I certainly think solution journalism in Al Jazeera, and I would say at other media organizations, I think it should, my view is it should be an in-house term, and it's all about how you write that opener to your story in very kind of conversational language that tangibly shows why they should invest in the story, and lay out like what you are trying to solve in the issue. You don't necessarily have to present that you know all the answers in the first 5 minutes. You can go on a journey and explore different approaches. But I do think you need to use conversational language, like how do we solve this, as opposed to this is a piece of solutions journalism.
Yeah, I loved the title of the ABC's podcast, Who's Going to Save Us? It's not, here is the ABC's Solutions Journalism Climate, switch off by, you know, because it's too worthy. So there's also
it can come across as preachy. It can come across as preachy too.
Yeah. I just wanted to touch on a couple of the questions that are actually around some of the fundamentals of this. So the framework, I've been asked to clarify the framework mentioned earlier for structuring stories to ensure they meet a good standard for solutions journalism, 4 different steps. In the context of what we've just said, it is important that it covers what is the response that's being made to a problem or challenge. How does it work? Because people need to know enough about it to think, would that work here, or with adjustment, or not at all? What's the evidence or data? Having evidence or data in your story is what stops it from being a public relations piece or a puff piece, right? I say, it's fantastic. You go, great, I shall report on that. Nope, that's PR. Where's your evidence? What's your figures? Have you got qualitative, which is anecdotal evidence, or do you have quantitative? Have you got some hard figures? Where are they from? Who paid for that? You know, who did the research? And also acknowledging there's no such thing as a silver bullet or really a solution. Everything is always iterative. And so what are the limitations? That might be, what problems have you run into so far? And what might be the logical endpoint of this where you'd need to try something else as well or instead of? We're just coming up to sort of the end, really. So I might ask Drew and Sabra for any other comments on the questions that you've seen, or anything you wanted to add or elaborate on.
No, give it a crack. Like I say, progress, not perfection.
Love it. Yeah, Drew. Any closing thoughts?
The only other thing that I would say is, through presentations like this and other things, there are plenty of illustrative examples that you could go, we've done this series of stories. This is how a newspaper in Denmark did it. Like it's convincing editors to do things is always a challenging thing, but you've got to think really creatively about you know, what is the buy-in for them to do this. Like some of the ways that I've got it over the line is to say, well, this is an evergreen story that we can repeat for the next 2 years as repeated content. It's not going to change, and it's a really good solution, and it's a great global South story. Other times I go, you know, it could be it's a good piece of content that could be embedded on news stories that are continually happening, like domestic violence. Like videos do really well when of solution stories when they're constantly embedded on an evolving kind of social issue or problem. So it's all about, I think, spelling out the tangible benefits of doing this and finding ways to make your editor or your commissioner see, you know, the tangible benefits of doing it. It's not necessarily going, here's the solutions journalism framework. It's just more like, God, our series of domestic violence stories was so bleak. Have you seen what this shelter's been doing? Catch and bring them imagination in a more conversational way might be the way to do it, as opposed to using what you've been learning like a Bible.
Absolutely. And I guess, you know, from the internal perspective, it's useful to have a way of tagging or capturing metadata so that at least it's searchable. That then gives you that evidence to go back to perhaps your revenue sources or different parts of the business to say, we know that it's tracking in this way. You've got some way of categorizing it internally, even if it's not expressed in quite those terms to the audience. Dear friends, it's 29 minutes past, which means it's time to wrap up. So very grateful to our two guest speakers, Sabra Lane from the ABC and Drew Ambrose, who's been up at a very late time of the night in Geneva from Al Jazeera. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Nice to meet
Thanks
you.
for your attendance, and thanks, Corinne.
Thanks, everybody. And everything will be on our website by the weekend. So have a great few days. Thanks, everyone.